In 1949, Washington and its allies signed one of the most important sentences of the early Cold War. It told Moscow one thing: if you push too far, you do not face one country, you face all of them. That sentence changed the calculus of confrontation, not because it promised war, but because it promised certainty. And in the logic of superpower rivalry, certainty was among the most powerful weapons available. This is the story of how the North Atlantic Treaty Organization came to exist. Not as a story of speeches and ceremonies, but as a story of hard choices made by people who understood that improvisation could not protect a continent forever. Archival records and diplomatic cables agree on certain details that public memory often overlooks. The exhausted European leaders who knew their nations could not stand alone against Soviet pressure. The American congressmen who debated whether their country should bind itself to distant allies. The diplomats who spent months crafting language that would be strong enough to deter and careful enough to survive political opposition. The military planners who had to translate promises into actual defense capabilities. Years later, one diplomat who participated in the negotiations would describe the atmosphere in terms that stayed with those who heard it. He said they were writing a check that their children might have to cash. The weight of that responsibility shaped every word. This is their story. The story of how the Western democracies stopped improvising and started promising. How they moved from reaction to deterrence. How they told Moscow, in language that could not be misunderstood, that the rules had changed. NATO was born when the message changed from "we will react" to "do not try." Now zoom in on a corridor in the State Department late on a winter evening in early 1949. The lights are still on in a few offices. Ashtrays are full. Coffee has gone cold. A small group of officials is reviewing the latest draft of a treaty that will bind their country to the defense of nations thousands of miles away. One of them pauses over a phrase. He knows that this language will be read in Moscow within days of publication. He knows that Soviet analysts will search for any weakness, any ambiguity, any gap between promise and commitment. He knows that the wrong word could invite exactly the kind of test the treaty is meant to prevent. The pressure is immense. Get the language right and you might prevent a war. Get it wrong and you might cause one. Or worse, you might create a promise that collapses at the moment of truth, leaving allies exposed and credibility destroyed. He crosses out a phrase and writes a new one. Tomorrow there will be more arguments about whether this version is too strong for the Senate or too weak for the Europeans. Tonight there is only the work. The Berlin airlift had ended in what looked like victory. The cargo planes had kept the city alive. Soviet pressure had failed. Western resolve had been demonstrated to the world. But even as the last flights continued their runs, even as the crisis moved toward resolution, the people responsible for Western security were asking harder questions. Questions that the celebration could not answer. Berlin showed the West could respond with courage and creativity. But it also showed how close that response had come to failure. The airlift had been improvised. It had depended on individual courage, on logistical ingenuity, on 1,000 small decisions made under pressure by people who had no template to follow. Pilots flew until exhaustion. Ground crews worked around the clock. Planners calculated fuel and food with margins so thin that a few bad weather days could have broken the operation. It had worked. But it had required the full attention of American and British leadership for months. It had consumed resources at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. It had required something that planners never want to depend on: luck. In rooms across Washington and London, the question was not whether the airlift had succeeded. The question was whether the West could keep rolling the dice. Declassified assessments from that period reveal the anxiety beneath the public confidence. Western planners understood that the Soviet Union had tested a limit in Berlin. They understood that the test had failed. But they also understood that Moscow would test again. Different place, different method, different pressure point. The question was not whether another crisis would come. The question was whether the West could keep improvising its way through each one. Now consider a planning room in Washington in the months after Berlin. Maps covered the walls. Reports stacked on tables. Officers and diplomats reviewing scenarios that kept them awake at night. A colonel stands at a map of Europe, pointing to the line where Western forces ended and Soviet forces began. The geography is stark. The Soviet Union and its satellite states form an unbroken block stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks. air forces that could reach any Western European capital within hours. Western Europe, by contrast, is fragmented. Different nations with different armies and different capabilities, some recovering, some still occupied, some strong on paper but weak in practice, each with its own political constraints and its own limits on what it could commit to any collective effort. Someone asks the question that hangs over every discussion: if Moscow chooses to push somewhere other than Berlin, will the response be as unified? Will it come as quickly? Will it be enough? No one in that room can answer with confidence. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes the situation dangerous. Here is where the logic of deterrence becomes clear. Deterrence is not about winning a fight, it is about preventing the fight from starting. It works by making the cost of aggression so obvious, so certain, so unavoidable, that the potential aggressor decides the risk is not worth taking. But deterrence requires credibility. It requires the adversary to believe that the promised response will actually happen. And credibility cannot be improvised in the moment of crisis. It must be established beforehand. It must be written down. It must be demonstrated through commitment that cannot be easily reversed. Consider the kind of scenario that kept planners awake. Before any formal alliance, a crisis in a small Western European nation creates a choice for every other nation. Respond and risk escalation. Stand aside and accept the consequences. Each capital makes its own calculation. Each government weighs its own interests. Each delay gives the aggressor more time to present the world with a fait accompli. By the time responses are coordinated, if they are coordinated at all, the moment may have passed. The small nation may already be lost, and every other small nation learns the lesson. Promises without structure are worthless when the pressure comes. This was the scenario that haunted Western planners. Not a massive invasion announced with fanfare, but pressure applied in slices. One nation at a time, each crisis too small to justify the ultimate response. Each response too slow and too fragmented to succeed. The Berlin airlift had shown courage, but courage alone does not deter. What deters is the certainty that courage will be applied every time in every place, without hesitation or delay. Who decides to respond? Who pays the cost? Who bleeds if the decision comes too late? Improvisation could save a city. It could not protect a continent. The idea of collective defense did not begin in Washington. It began in Europe. Among nations that understood vulnerability in ways that Americans, protected by two oceans, had never fully experienced. Brussels tried to create structure. In March 1948, even as the Berlin crisis was building, 5 Western European nations signed what became known as the Treaty of Brussels. Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg committed to mutual defense. If one was attacked, all would respond. This was remarkable for its time. These were nations still rebuilding from the most destructive war in human history. Their economies were shattered. Their cities still showed bomb damage. Their populations were exhausted and wary of any new commitments that might lead to more conflict. The psychological weight of the post-war years pressed down on every decision. These were countries where families still mourned the dead from the last war, where rationing continued years after victory, where the sounds of reconstruction competed with the sounds of normal life. The idea of preparing for another conflict, of building another military structure, of making another set of promises that might require sacrifice, was almost unbearable. And yet they understood that recovery meant nothing if security could not be guaranteed. In a cabinet room in London, ministers gathered around a table covered with documents. Intelligence reports describing Soviet force dispositions in Eastern Europe. Economic assessments showing how many years genuine military recovery would take. Political analysis warning of communist pressure in Italy and France, where local parties took orders from Moscow and might destabilize governments from within. The Foreign Secretary reviewed the arithmetic with his colleagues. It was brutal. Soviet and satellite forces outnumbered anything the Western Europeans could field by significant margins. The industrial capacity to rebuild military strength existed in theory, but rebuilding would take years, and the pressure might not wait years. One minister raised the question that everyone was thinking. We can sign a treaty among ourselves. We can promise to defend each other. But can we actually deliver on that promise if the moment comes? The room was quiet. Everyone knew the answer. A promise without capability is not deterrence, it is hope. And hope is not a strategy. The Brussels Treaty was meaningful. It demonstrated that Western European nations could overcome their historical divisions and commit to collective action. It created a framework. It sent a signal. But the signatories knew it was not sufficient. Diplomatic cables from this period capture the growing consensus among European leaders. Their commitment to each other was real. Their willingness to fight was genuine. But without additional strength, without the weight that only a major power could provide, the commitment might collapse under pressure. That additional strength could only come from the United States. The European request was not for charity. It was not for protection given freely out of generosity. It was for partnership, for commitment, for the kind of binding promise that would change Soviet calculations fundamentally. This was not submission to American power. It was credibility engineering. European leaders understood that their own promises would only be believed in Moscow if those promises were backed by American power. Without the American anchor, the Brussels Treaty was a gesture of intent. With the American anchor, it became a strategic reality that Moscow could not ignore. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin became one of the most persistent voices making this case. His reasoning was practical rather than sentimental. He framed the problem in terms that diplomats and strategists could understand. Europe needed an anchor. Something heavy enough that Soviet pressure could not move it. Something strong enough that Moscow would understand the futility of trying. Bevin worked through the problem like an engineer examining a structural failure. What would it take to make Moscow believe that aggression would fail? Not hope it would fail. Believe it would fail with certainty. The answer always came back to the same place. American commitment. American industrial capacity. American military power. American willingness to treat an attack on Paris or Brussels the same as an attack on New York. Without that commitment, the Brussels Treaty was a signal of intent that might or might not be believed. With it, the equation changed entirely. The Europeans wanted a guarantee. Only an ally with global weight could provide it. Washington debated whether to answer that call. And the debate was genuine. The argument inside the United States was intense. It was not theater. Real disagreements existed. Real concerns were raised. Real arguments had to be won. For most of American history, the guiding principle of foreign policy had been clear. Avoid permanent alliances. Stay out of European quarrels. Let the old world manage its own affairs while America developed its own strength in its own hemisphere. This was not isolationism in the crude sense of ignoring the world entirely. It was a strategic choice based on geography and historical experience. America was far from the traditional centers of great power conflict. 2 world wars had pulled it in. But both times, many Americans had hoped it would be the last time. That tradition did not disappear after 1945. Powerful voices in Congress still argued for restraint. They represented constituents who remembered the costs of the last war. They worried about new costs. They asked uncomfortable questions. The debate operated on multiple levels, each with its own logic and its own fears. The constitutional question came first. Could the United States bind itself to automatic military response without undermining the constitutional power of Congress to declare war? Could a treaty signed by one administration obligate future administrations to actions they might not choose? What happened to democratic accountability if the decision for war was made in advance, locked into treaty language that could not easily be changed? Senators who took their constitutional responsibilities seriously wrestled with these questions. They were not looking for excuses to avoid commitment. They were trying to understand what commitment meant in a system designed to prevent the concentration of power. The fiscal question followed close behind. Military readiness costs money. Sustained military readiness costs sustained money. A permanent alliance with Europe meant permanent military spending at levels that peacetime budgets had never contemplated. In a senator's office on Capitol Hill, staff members spread budget projections across a desk. The numbers were sobering. Troops stationed overseas, equipment maintained at high readiness, infrastructure built and maintained across the Atlantic, training exercises, logistics networks, the cost of being prepared to fight at any moment, indefinitely. Letters from constituents piled up on another desk. Farmers asking why their taxes should defend countries they could not find on a map. Veterans asking why their sons might be sent to fight in conflicts that seemed far away. Businessmen asking whether the economy could sustain open-ended military commitments abroad. These were not foolish concerns. They were legitimate questions raised by serious people who genuinely believed that American interests might be better served by caution than by commitment. And beneath the constitutional and fiscal questions lay a deeper strategic question. Why should the defense of Europe be treated as the defense of America itself? The argument that ultimately prevailed addressed this question directly. It was not about generosity or idealism. It was about cold strategic calculation. The proponents of the alliance made their case in terms of American self-interest rather than European need. The logic was straightforward but compelling. The cost of commitment now was high. But the cost of standing apart would be higher. If Western Europe fell under Soviet domination, whether through military conquest or political intimidation, the consequences for America would be severe. The industrial capacity of Europe combined with Soviet resources would create a rival power bloc of enormous strength. American trade would be constrained. American influence would shrink. The balance of global power would shift decisively against the United States. More immediately, another war in Europe would cost American lives. It had happened twice already in the century. The pattern was clear. America could not remain apart when the European balance collapsed. It would be drawn in eventually. The only question was whether it would be drawn in early, on favorable terms, or late, on desperate ones. In a committee room in the Capitol, senators gathered to hear testimony from military and diplomatic officials. Maps showed the strategic situation. Charts showed the economic interdependence between America and Europe. Witnesses explained what Soviet domination of the continent would mean for American security and American prosperity. The atmosphere was serious. These were men who remembered the last war. Some had served in it. Some had lost friends or family in it. They understood what was at stake in ways that abstract policy debates could not capture. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan helped build the consensus that made the treaty possible. He had been a leading isolationist before the war. The shock of Pearl Harbor and its aftermath had changed his thinking. Now he used his credibility with skeptics to make the case for commitment. Vandenberg understood that he was asking his colleagues to abandon traditions that ran deep in American political culture. He did not dismiss their concerns. He addressed them directly. The world had changed. Distance no longer protected. Technology no longer permitted delay. The oceans that had once been America's shield were now highways that any enemy could cross. The choice was not between involvement and isolation. The choice was between early involvement on favorable terms and late involvement after disaster had already begun. The public mood was complex. Newspapers carried debates about the wisdom of foreign commitments. Radio commentators argued both sides. Americans were tired of war and wary of new obligations. But they were also aware of the Soviet threat and uncertain about what it might mean for their own security. The administration worked to build support not just in Congress but among the public. Officials gave speeches explaining why European security mattered to American security. They framed the alliance not as a gift to Europe, but as an investment in American safety. The vote in the Senate was overwhelming. 82 in favor, 13 opposed. The margin reflected the strength of the argument and the skill with which it had been made. NATO was a bet, spend now to avoid bleeding later. The core of the treaty was simple enough to explain in a sentence. Complex enough that diplomats and lawyers spent months getting the language exactly right. The principle was collective defense. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all members. Each member would be obligated to respond, not necessarily with immediate military force in every case, but with appropriate action to restore and maintain security. On paper it looked simple. In practice it never is. The real work was engineering the sentence, crafting language that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. The words had to be strong enough to deter Moscow, clear enough that Soviet analysts could not find loopholes, flexible enough to satisfy American constitutional concerns, acceptable to a dozen different governments with a dozen different political constraints. In a conference room where negotiators gathered around a long table, drafts circulated with phrases crossed out and rewritten. Each word was debated. Each phrase was tested against multiple audiences. One senior diplomat held up a page covered with revisions. He reminded his colleagues that this document would be read in Moscow as carefully as in any Western capital. Soviet analysts would search for any ambiguity, any suggestion that the commitment might waver, any hint that some members were less protected than others. The goal was to eliminate ambiguity entirely, to make the commitment so clear that Soviet planners could not hope to divide the Allies or isolate individual members, to create a situation where any aggression would trigger not a question of whether to respond, but only a question of how. But the treaty also had to survive domestic politics in every signatory nation. In the United States, that meant respecting the constitutional role of Congress. The treaty could not promise automatic war. It had to promise action while leaving the form of that action to be determined by each nation according to its own constitutional processes. The negotiators found language that balanced these requirements. Each party would take such action as it deemed necessary, including the use of armed force. The commitment was real. The flexibility was built in. The ambiguity that Moscow might exploit was eliminated. This was not weakness disguised as flexibility. It was precision. The treaty said exactly what it meant. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. The response would be collective. The specifics would be determined by the situation and by each nation's own processes. Diplomatic minutes from the negotiations show how seriously the drafters took every phrase. They knew that these words would shape behavior for decades. They knew that a single poorly chosen phrase could undermine the entire structure. They worked with the care of engineers building a bridge that lives would depend on. When the document was finally complete, it represented a careful balance, strong enough to deter, precise enough to bind, flexible enough to survive political challenges in a dozen different democracies. Here is what changed when the signatures were complete. Before the treaty, Soviet planners could calculate risks country by country. They could apply pressure to Norway and watch whether Denmark responded. They could threaten Italy and observe whether Britain reacted. Each Western nation faced its own calculations about whether to resist, whether to accommodate, whether to hope the problem would resolve itself. After the treaty, the calculation changed fundamentally. Pressure on Norway was pressure on America. A threat to Italy was a threat to Britain. The dividing lines that Moscow might have exploited no longer existed in the same way. A promise only deters when it is believable. The treaty made the promise believable. Moscow's reaction to the treaty was immediate and hostile. The Soviet government denounced the alliance as aggressive, provocative, and directed against peaceful coexistence. Propaganda organs described NATO as an instrument of American imperialism designed to encircle and threaten the Soviet Union. This reaction was expected, but understanding why Moscow reacted so strongly reveals how much the treaty changed the strategic equation. In a room in Moscow, where analysts gathered to assess Western moves, the treaty documents were studied with intense focus. Maps covered the walls showing the new alignment. Planners marked the boundaries of the new reality. For years, Soviet strategy had relied on certain advantages: geographic proximity to Western Europe, conventional military superiority on the continent, the ability to apply pressure selectively, exploiting divisions among Western nations, the exhaustion and weakness of European economies still recovering from war. The treaty negated many of these advantages. Geographic proximity meant less when the adversary included a superpower across the Atlantic with industrial capacity that dwarfed anything in Europe. Military superiority on the ground was less decisive when balanced against American air power and the industrial base that could sustain a prolonged conflict. The ability to divide and pressure individual nations was undermined when those nations had bound themselves together in formal alliance. One Soviet analyst traced the new boundaries on a map. Before, he could point to pressure points where individual nations might be tested, intimidated, brought to accommodation one by one. After, every pressure point connected to every other. Pull one thread, and the whole fabric responded. This was exactly what Moscow did not want to see. The encirclement narrative was useful for domestic propaganda. Soviet citizens could be told that hostile forces were gathering around their motherland, justifying continued sacrifice and vigilance. But internally, Soviet planners knew the real problem was not encirclement. The real problem was unity. A divided West was manageable. Individual nations could be pressured, seduced, or intimidated. Deals could be made with one capital that isolated another. The natural tensions among Western democracies could be exploited. A united West was a different problem. It removed the option of selective pressure. It raised the stakes of any confrontation. It meant that Soviet strategists had to calculate not whether they could prevail against France alone or Italy alone, but whether they could prevail against everyone at once. Declassified materials suggest that Soviet leaders understood the Western commitment was real. They might dismiss it in public statements as paper promises that would dissolve under pressure, but their internal planning took it seriously. Military planners adjusted their calculations. Political strategists reconsidered their options. The straightforward path to expanding Soviet influence in Western Europe had become considerably more complicated. After 1949, pressure on one capital meant pressure on all. Not everyone in the West celebrated the treaty without reservation. Even as the Senate voted overwhelmingly in favor, dissenting voices raised concerns that deserve attention, not because they were right in every detail, but because their presence demonstrates that the decision was made with eyes open, aware of risks as well as benefits. George Kennan, the diplomat whose analysis of Soviet behavior had shaped American containment policy, had doubts about the military emphasis of the new alliance. In his office at the State Department, Kennan reviewed the treaty language with a sense of unease. He understood the logic of collective defense. He did not dispute the reality of the Soviet threat, but he worried about the direction the Western response was taking. Kennan's original conception of containment had been primarily political and economic. He believed the Soviet system contained internal weaknesses that would eventually cause it to mellow or collapse. The Western task was to prevent Soviet expansion while those internal processes worked themselves out. Economic recovery in Europe, political stability, demonstration that democratic capitalism offered a better life than Soviet communism. These were the tools Kennan believed would ultimately prevail. A formal military alliance worried him because it might militarize a confrontation that could be won by other means. Once military structures were built, military logic would dominate. Once forces were positioned, the pressure to build more forces would become irresistible. Once the confrontation became primarily military, the risk of actual military conflict would increase. Kennan feared that NATO would provoke exactly the kind of arms buildup and escalation spiral it was meant to prevent. He saw the possibility of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The West arms to deter the Soviets. The Soviets arm more to counter the Western buildup. The West arms more still. Each side becomes more dangerous, not less. And somewhere along the spiral, a spark might ignite something that could have been avoided. What the treaty's defenders saw as a shield, Kennan worried might become a trigger. He also questioned whether military commitment would encourage European dependence rather than European strength. If America guaranteed European security, would European nations invest in their own capabilities or simply rely on American protection? Would the alliance create partners or dependents? These concerns were serious and came from deep understanding of both Soviet behavior and the dynamics of international politics. Kennan was not naive about Soviet intentions. He simply believed there might be better ways to address them. Other critics raised different objections. Some worried about cost. Some worried about constitutional implications. Some questioned whether distant commitments served American interests. Some feared that the United States was overextending itself, taking on obligations it could not sustain indefinitely. Archival records preserve these debates because they matter. They show that the decision to create NATO was not made in ignorance or enthusiasm. It was made with full awareness of the risks and costs involved. The decision-makers of 1949 understood they were making a consequential bet. They believed the bet was necessary. They believed the alternatives were worse. But they did not pretend certainty they did not possess. What tipped the balance was the weight of recent experience. Berlin had shown that Soviet pressure would continue. European weakness had shown that the continent could not defend itself alone. American interests had shown that standing apart was not a viable long-term option. In that context, the critics lost the argument, not because their concerns were dismissed as foolish, but because the urgency of the moment seemed to demand action despite the risks. Even inside Washington, the decision was a gamble, but it was a gamble made with clear eyes. NATO did not begin as celebration. It began as necessity. The immediate effect of the treaty was as much psychological as military. In the months after signing, no Soviet forces moved against Western Europe. No dramatic crisis tested the new commitment immediately. The confrontation continued, but it continued within different boundaries. This absence of immediate crisis was itself significant. It suggested that the treaty was working as intended, not by winning a conflict, but by preventing one from starting. The logic of deterrence is counterintuitive. Success looks like nothing happening. The measure of effectiveness is the crisis that never occurs, the pressure that is never applied, the aggression that is never attempted. There are no medals for wars that do not happen. No parades for victories that take the form of quiet stability. But beneath the surface calm, intense work was underway. The promise had been made. Now the promise had to become capability. In a conference room where military officers from a dozen nations gathered for the first time, the challenge was immediately apparent. Different languages, different equipment, different traditions, different doctrines developed over decades of separate national experience. An American general found himself sitting across from a French colonel and a British brigadier, trying to establish how their forces would actually work together in a crisis. Basic questions had no easy answers. Who commands combined operations? How do communication systems connect? What happens when equipment from different nations cannot share ammunition or spare parts? The work was tedious. It involved endless meetings about standardization, agreements about radio frequencies and map coordinates, discussions about how orders would be transmitted across language barriers, plans for which units would deploy where and how quickly they could move. None of this was dramatic. None of it made headlines, but all of it was essential. A promise without capability is not deterrence. It is hope dressed up as strategy. Over months and years, the alliance developed the structures that would make its promise credible. Command arrangements were established. Training exercises brought forces together to practice coordination. Standards were agreed so that equipment from different nations could work together. Intelligence was shared so that all members understood the threat they faced. This process was slow and often frustrating. National interests did not disappear simply because a treaty was signed. Disagreements about burden sharing began immediately and would continue for decades. Different strategic perspectives created tension between members who faced different threats. But the fundamental structure held. The commitment remained. The signal to Moscow stayed consistent. In a planning headquarters, officers reviewed maps, showing how forces would respond to various contingencies. The plans were constantly updated as capabilities changed and intelligence evolved. The goal was to reduce the time between threat and response, to make the alliance's reaction so fast and so certain that no Soviet planner could count on a window of hesitation. Unity became a habit. Coordination became routine. The alliance developed the procedures and reflexes that would allow it to function under pressure. The promise did not guarantee perfect peace. It guaranteed that the cost of breaking the peace would be high. The treaty signed in Washington in April 1949 created a framework that would endure for decades. It bound together nations that had been enemies within living memory. It committed the United States to the defense of Europe in terms that could not easily be revoked or ignored. The work of building the alliance in practice had only begun. The debates about burden sharing and strategy would continue for generations. The challenges of maintaining unity among diverse democracies would test every assumption. But the fundamental message had been delivered. To Western Europeans who feared they stood alone. To Americans who debated whether distant commitments served their interests. And most importantly, to Moscow. The Western democracies had stopped improvising. They had started promising. And they had created a structure designed to make those promises credible. For the moment, the architecture of deterrence was complete. The line was drawn. The commitment was made. The signal was sent. NATO told Moscow that intimidation would not work anymore. Then Moscow answered with a different kind of intimidation. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb.